Okay, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from today. Thank you so much for being here. Today, this webinar is focused on a new report on advancing the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy into a new decade. We're so excited to see so many people who are interested in this discussion, and we're really looking forward to having a conversation with you later on. For those who don't know me, my name is Maggie Johnson. I am the Climate Adaptation Program Manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and I also coordinate the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Network, who is hosting this webinar today. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes for you. You'll notice that you are muted and you will be for the entirety of the webinar. So if you need to get in touch with us, please use the chat box. We have folks standing by monitoring that and will help you as best as they can. If you have any questions, please use the question and answer box. We'll take all of the questions at the end, or at least as many as we can get through. But you are encouraged to submit questions at any time throughout the presentations. And I'm sure that will be very helpful for our moderator to identify some common questions and themes that the audience has. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with everyone who has registered, and you're free to share that with anyone else who you think would really find interest and benefit from the conversation today. So before we get started, I also want to acknowledge the many contributors to this report, and you'll be hearing from several of them today. Thank you to all of them for all of the time and the expertise that they put into making this report what it is. I'm very grateful for their leadership on that. So I want to quickly give a little bit of background on the strategy. And when I say the strategy, I mean the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy. So in 2009, Congress directed the Department of the Interior and the Council on Environmental Quality to develop a strategy addressing climate impacts on natural resources. And they pulled together an interagency work group, and they developed and published the strategy in 2012. It was designed to enable natural resource managers to both better understand and to take more effective steps towards climate adaptation for fish, wildlife, and plants. The strategy covered a ton of information, but probably the most iconic are the 7 strategy goals that are listed here. And you'll see they cover high-level themes such as connecting and conserving habitat, utilizing adaptive management practices, and reducing non-climate stressors such as pollution or habitat fragmentation. Each of these goals have tactics and actions associated with them, and this provided managers with a variety of ways to implement actions on the ground. And that's really important. The strategy is really rooted in taking action. Now, after the strategy was published, the interagency work group wanted to formalize. And so they created what became known as the Joint Implementation Working Group, or for short, the JWIG. And this was a body of experts who were working to advance implementation of the strategy, track its progress, and take up any revisions as needed over time. And I should note here that the strategy was always meant to be revised or updated, or at least looked at for that, within 5 to 10 years of publication. Over the years, the JWIG produced various reports tracking how the strategy was being implemented. And this was largely through case studies. Unfortunately, the JWIG was stood down in 2017, and this was due to shifting priorities at the federal level. And it really left a vacuum for leadership and coordination. So in 2019, AFWA, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, decided to step in to form an informal JWIG-like group that we now call the network. The network works to advance leadership, coordination, and communication for the conservation community on climate adaptation issues. The new report we are discussing today was developed by the network and looks back on what the strategy has accomplished, identifies gaps therein, and provides recommendations for future revisions or updates. So with all of that background, I think it's time we can go ahead and dive into the report. So today we'll be covering the three main sections of the report. So we'll start off with Ted Weber, who is the Climate Adaptation Policy Analyst for Defenders of Wildlife. And he'll walk us through part one, which deals with the state of the science and the state of the practice. After that, we'll hear from Rachel Novak, who is the Tribal Resilience Coordinator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And she'll walk us through a special section within part one that focuses on Indigenous knowledges. After that, we have Dr. Bob Newman, Professor of Biology at the University of North Dakota, and who is also the chair of the Wildlife Society's Climate Change and Wildlife Working Group. And he will talk through part two, which looks at the strategy goals and crosswalking those with a variety of different conservation plans. And then I will come back for part three to talk about some of the recommendations and next steps that we have following the publication of the report. And then Rob Kroll, who is the Policy Analyst and Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, has been gracious enough to be our moderator today. And so he'll be helping to facilitate the discussion among our panelists and our audience. And then a big shout out to Nikki Cooley, who's the co-manager for the Climate Change Program for the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, and Amy Delac, who is the Senior Policy Analyst for Climate Adaptation at Defenders of Wildlife, who are both monitoring the chat box and will provide any tech help as they can. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pass the mic on over to Ted. So Ted, please feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Maggie. Let's see. So I'm going to quickly summarize part one of the strategy, which provides a brief update on the state of climate science since the 2012 report. We reviewed greenhouse gas-induced changes to the climate and oceans, existing stressors and climate change impacts on fish, wildlife, and plants, and impacts to ecosystem services. In addition, we reviewed information on integrating Indigenous knowledges, which our next speaker will go over, and the state of climate adaptation practice. Obviously, that's a lot to cover in a few minutes, so I encourage you to take a look at the report after and to really dive into it. The 2012 strategy based its impact descriptions largely in the 2009 National Climate Assessment, as well as hundreds of relevant scientific papers. For the 2021 strategy update, we referenced the fourth National Climate Assessment published in 2018, plus newer sources of data. And I'll just mention a few highlights. So for example, in 2010, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere was 390 parts per million. As of 2019, it had increased to 411 parts per million. Average annual surface air temperatures rose about 1 degree Celsius in the US between 1900 and 2010, And between 2010 and 2019, the temperature climbed another 0.17 degrees Celsius. Along the northeast continental shelf, ocean temperatures are accelerating dramatically, with temperatures rising 0.14 degrees Celsius per year between 2007 and 2016. Sea level rise is accelerating also. The rising sea temperatures are increasing hurricane intensity and rainfall, and forest fires are burning more and more area. So the take home is that climate change hasn't solved itself since our first report. The 2012 strategy report provided its lengthy overview of climate change impacts on fish, wildlife, and plants. The update provides a supplement from recent findings. For example, we looked at the ability of some species like pikas to alter their behavior to adapt to changing climate. For some species, though, shifting behavior may not be sufficient. Another example, climate warming has driven reductions in body size. Alarmingly, for fish and other aquatic animals, warming temperatures increase oxygen demand and at the same time decrease dissolved oxygen. Over half the plant and animal species in North America have demonstrated range shifts, and phenological shifts are continuing across taxonomic groups and ecosystem types. Climate change doesn't act alone. It amplifies the effects of other stressors like habitat fragmentation, invasive species, pollution, disease, and overexploitation. As a result, many native species are experiencing population declines, and climate change is enabling invasions and range expansions by some non-native species. Climate change impacts can hinder the ability of ecosystems to provide services to humans. For example, tidal marshes can protect inland areas from storm surges, but these marshes are disappearing as sea level rises. Another example, warming temperatures and droughts could reduce fish and game populations. Biodiversity losses can reduce ecotourism, which many local economies rely on. On the other hand, protecting and restoring ecosystems will not only benefit wildlife, fish, and plants, it will benefit human health and well-being in the face of climate change. Adaptation solutions like reforestation and avoiding deforestation could provide 1/3 of the climate mitigation needed to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And addressing silvicultural practices like extending stand rotations and reducing damage from fire, pests, and diseases could also reduce climate change. Protecting and restoring wetlands and floodplains can reduce the threat of flooding from extreme weather events and provide valuable habitat and ecological connectivity across a changing landscape. And in urban areas, green spaces can reduce stormwater runoff and excess heat. Since the strategy's initial publication in 2012, the field of climate adaptation has grown substantially. Several frameworks and guidance efforts have been developed. For example, the Climate Smart Conservation Cycle incorporates climate adaptation principles into conservation plans and actions while acknowledging uncertainty via adaptive management. The Resist, Accept, Direct, or RAD framework describes management responses to climate change and whether to resist, accept, or direct the change. The Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project also categorizes management into different strategies. And the Tribal Adaptation Guidebook follows a holistic approach called community-driven climate resilience planning. Proper identification, protection, and management of refugia will be essential to protect biodiversity and ecosystem services in a changing climate. Despite regional climate changes, some locations may continue to provide suitable habitat, at least temporarily. Like shaded areas like north-facing slopes receive less solar heating and will stay cooler than non-shaded areas. And valleys and coves that pool cold air will also stay cooler. Areas near deep lakes or oceans will also warm more slowly due to the high heat capacity of water. And wet areas, including wetlands, riparian zones, and fog belts, can also act as refugia, especially if fed by groundwater, the wetlands and riparian zones. They can remain moist during droughts and also cool the air. and tree canopies can buffer ground temperatures. As species locations, interactions, and behaviors change, habitat connectivity must also become more dynamic. So when current habitat is lost, species can migrate to cooler or moister locations. Likewise, temporary climate refugia should be connected to future refugia to facilitate continued migration as conditions further change. Even temporary refugia may serve as vital stepping stones and may subsequently provide habitat for other species that are more heat or drought tolerant. Streams and riparian areas can make especially suitable corridors of protected and restored where necessary. To briefly sum up, our management recommendations included considering climate change impacts when developing management goals and objectives, integrating adaptive management, conserving and managing habitat at multiple scales, identifying, protecting, and managing refugia, and researching and managing invasive species and diseases. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Rachel.
All right, thanks so much, Ted. Okay. All right. Well, Akaha, thank you for your interest in this new and vital update to the 2012 strategy. My name is Rachel Novak, and I am Dene from the Navajo Nation, and I serve as the BIA Tribal Climate Resilience Program Coordinator. And I'll first introduce myself in our traditional way, as I was taught to do when I speak publicly. Yat Rachel Novak Kinisha, said the excuse need the net nishle, Belagana Bashish in, Kenyani Dashiche, Tonton additionally. Thank you for participating today. And today I am speaking to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico. This area is the homeland of several pueblos, including the Sandia, Laguna, and Isleto pueblos. And I'm happy to look outside and see our southern sacred mountain as well of our tribe, Tzotzil. So welcome you from wherever you are. Today, I'm happy to provide a brief overview of the Indigenous Knowledges chapter from the 2021 report. We do have a specific recommendation as part of the strategy that you saw briefly on Ted's last slide, and that reads, recognize that Indigenous knowledges are valid and valuable systems of knowledge equal in value to Western science and crucial for addressing climate change impacts in an inclusive way. So today I'm first going to go over a brief definition of traditional knowledges, and then I'll talk about some methodologies for working with traditional knowledges. And then we'll go over a few examples to illustrate how they can inform climate change adaptation planning, research, and implementation. And then I'll follow it up with a discussion of the importance of ethical considerations and how to protect Indigenous knowledges from misappropriation and other risks. So, okay, so, oops. Okay, so first, what are Indigenous knowledges? There are several definitions, and we use the fourth National Climate Assessment definition from 2018, since it was in the context of climate change. And so Indigenous knowledges refer to Indigenous people's systems of observing, monitoring, research, recording, communicating, and learning that are required to support survival and flourishing in an ecosystem, and in the social and adaptive capacity to adjust or prepare for changes. And additional definitions also emphasize, the temporal, the relational, and the holistic aspects of Indigenous knowledge as an accumulation of knowledge, practice, and belief acquired by Indigenous peoples over hundreds or thousands of years, or as many Indigenous people say, since time immemorial. So one of the major gaps from the 2012 strategy was that it didn't include any discussion of Indigenous knowledges and the importance of incorporating that body of knowledge into planning and implementation actions. So to rectify that, we include this section and we dive into much greater detail than other sections in part one in order to provide that space and time necessary to really understand this. So I'll be going over some examples in a few minutes that will help show the considerable value in combining Indigenous knowledges with Western science to create more comprehensive understanding and vision of species and ecosystems that can help us better understand and adapt to climate change. But first, I will go through some of the methods and good practices. So these are described in the report. And Indigenous and Western science both use observation and experience to better understand the natural world. And many of the methods used in work that align both Indigenous knowledges and Western science come from cultural anthropology. So they're things like literature reviews, semi-directed interviews, focus groups, participant observation, and linguistics. And then mapping can also be used with these methods to identify important areas like gathering sites, important habitats, species migration routes, etc. There's also more traditional practices that aren't found in the Western science methodologies like storytelling that are really important. And the community participation is also viewed as a crucial overall component to include in working with Indigenous knowledges. And this can be really important because when you engage with a community, it's much more likely that the community will benefit versus a more extractive model. And finally, good practices combined with these methods are also really important and include knowledge of and respect for protocols of Indigenous knowledge holders, attitudes approaching the earth, and the trust that you build with Indigenous nations and peoples with whom you work. Oops. All right, now I'm going to transition, oops, let me go back. Now I'm going to transition into some of the examples that are provided in the report to illustrate how the tribes are using Indigenous knowledge to inform the understanding of climate change planning, research, and implementation. So first, we have the Local Environmental Observer Network, or LEO, and that is an online tool that was created in 2012 by the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. And like the name says, it's a group of local observers and topic experts who share knowledge about unusual animal, environment, and weather events. And with LEO, you can connect with others in the community, share observations, raise awareness, and find answers about significant environmental events and changes. You can also engage with topic experts in many different organizations and become part of a broader observer community. And topics have included things like clam populations, berry populations, harmful algal blooms, river and sea ice changes, wildfire smoke, flooding and erosion, particularly along ocean and river coasts in Alaska. So the LEO network is a really great example of how local place-based knowledge from observers on the ground, who include Indigenous knowledge holders, can be combined with topical experts in Western science who don't necessarily have that long-term on-the-ground observation experience. And overall, those combined help to better understand changes that people are seeing in the environment, including those related to climate change. Okay, and our next example is from Northern California, and that is of the Yurok tribe. And this illustrates how tribes are using indigenous knowledge in their climate adaptation planning. So because Indigenous knowledges include relationships among species and a holistic understanding of healthy ecosystems and interconnections, they can help increase understanding of species and ecosystems, vulnerabilities, and resilience to climate change. So as part of their planning process, the Yurok tribe involved their elders and their community members. The Yurok Cultural Committee is made up mostly of elders, and they help determine priority planning areas for the initial climate plan for the Yurok tribe. And as part of this process, they spoke about their memories of the prairies being a really integral part of the forest ecosystems and the importance of the prairies to other animals, foods, and medicines of the people, and how they influence their hydrologic flows also in the streams. So changes like logging and fire suppression really affected the amount of prairie dramatically, and the loss, their loss, they were equating that with the cool groundwater recharge that is really important to the salmon. And so with the change in that, it does change the vulnerability of the cold water fish, like salmon waters, or salmon is the waters that they depend on warm with climate change. And the image there that we have is the Yurok Aquatic Harvesting Calendar. And if you'd like to find more information, you can look on the ITEP tribal profile at their website. All right, and the next example I want to share is from the Pacific Islands, and this one is focused on breadfruit agriculture, or agroforestry, really. And it really illustrates how Indigenous knowledge can help with the revitalization of traditional resource management techniques and innovate new ones that can adapt to climate change. So there are innovative traditional resource management techniques surrounding breadfruit agroforestry. And it's a perennial tree, and it has significant potential to contribute to building climate resilient food systems. It's a starchy, highly nutritional, gluten-free traditional crop. And the Olahana Foundation has been working to revitalize it in Indigenous and other communities of the Pacific Islands. And this is meant to help address food security and climate change challenges. Agroforests have been shown to be more resilient to climate extremes, pests, diseases, and can provide more diverse wildlife habitat than monocultures. Okay. So I want to also make sure that we don't miss the importance of the protection of Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous knowledges have high regard from Indigenous peoples, and they're becoming increasingly accepted and valued by Western scientists and managers as well. But with that comes increasing interest by non-tribal entities to work with tribes and incorporate these knowledges. And obviously there can be a lot of value in these collaborations, but many times tribes haven't experienced the benefit of those efforts, or they haven't been culturally sensitive or ethical or mutually beneficial. And there's other sorts of risks with sharing that information because Indigenous knowledges are place-based, and they rise where the Native cultures are inextricably linked. So taking those out of the broader context can lead to misinterpretation, misrepresentation, or potential misuse. And some tribes might even view this as a form of theft. So there's some really important things to be aware of in working with Indigenous nations and peoples. And two really important pillars of this are free, prior, and informed consent. It is an approach, a best practice, and a right when working with Indigenous communities. And the second one is cause no harm. And that is really important to help identify early and avoid any risks that could lead to loss or misappropriation of the traditional knowledges. And there's a very helpful document that exists called Guidelines for Considering Traditional Knowledges and Climate Change Initiatives. And that provides really specific measures that federal agencies, researchers, and tribes and traditional knowledge holders can follow throughout their initiatives around climate change. Okay, and then, so I just wanted to add some further sources for reading here. This is really focused more on that protections of traditional knowledges. So with that, I am going to pass the presentation on to my next colleague, Dr. Bob Newman. Thanks. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful presentation, and Ted for setting the stage, and Maggie for getting us started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's make sure that's coming up in. Are you seeing the slides, Maggie?
Yes, I am, but it's not in presentation mode yet.
All right, that's what I'm working on here. How about that?
Yep, looks good.
All right, so operating two screens is confusing for me, so hopefully no hangups. So thank you all for coming. I think this is a really interesting and exciting report and opportunity to kind of get ourselves up to date on how we're approaching climate change and climate change adaptation. I want to start by mentioning that I'm coming to you from the ancestral lands of the Red Lake and Pembina bands of Ojibwe and the Dakota Ayate. I'm also east and north of lands of the Lakota peoples and the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations here in North Dakota. So the Indigenous knowledges component of all of this is very timely and also very important where I live and probably where everybody lives. So Maggie already mentioned that we're starting off with this report, this strategy that was put together about 10 years ago by a fairly large group of experts from federal agencies, state agencies, tribal agencies, and they were getting together to figure out how we're supposed to deal with climate change based on what they knew at the time and the best science available to them. And they came up with a bunch of recommendations and goals that I think have really stood up well over time. And you see some of them listed here on this slide. So this is basically the Word version of the icons that Maggie had in her slide. And these are things that make a lot of sense. They would make sense even in the absence of climate change, but they're even more important when we're dealing with a changing world. So for example, conserving habitat, protecting ecosystem function, and managing for sustainable use, working with the adaptive management mindset where we're learning as we go and we're adjusting what we're doing as we learn. There's always uncertainty, and so increasing our knowledge, especially about impacts of climate change, is really important, and so on. So those are all things that are still very valuable and worth paying attention to. But I also think that we have an increasing sense of urgency because Ted mentioned some of the changes that we've seen in the climate since this report came out. And if you look at the 2020 report on the state of the climate, what you'll see is that, 2020 was the second warmest year on record since 1880. The 7 of the 10 warmest years, 7 of the warmest years on record have occurred since 2014. So since the strategy came out, and we're learning more and more about the impacts and seeing more about the impacts of climate change that Ted mentioned. So it's really important that we take stock of how things are going in terms of responding to climate change. That's what section 2 of this report does. And there's a lot of information in there, and in a short period of time, I'm just going to kind of really skim at a high level what we're talking about. I also wanted to mention that there's been a lot of work done over the last 10 years to further help people trying to make decisions about how to respond to climate change in the form of guidance documents and things like that. Climate smart conservation is probably one very familiar to anybody that's been involved in climate adaptation work. The Forest Service has a plan. USDA for the agricultural side has a plan. State wildlife action plans were expected by 2015 to include a climate change addendum, and presuming that will continue in the future. The National Park Service just released a big report on this Resist, Accept, Direct RAD framework that I think everybody should know about, and so I dropped that in here as well. And the goal of section 2, though, was really to take a look at the efforts that have been done in the states and tribes and the federal agencies, in non-governmental organizations, and see how well they correspond to the recommendations that the experts that put the strategy together suggested. And so we did that by taking a fairly superficial, I would say, look at all the work, a subset of the work that's being done. This lists some of the plans that we took a look at, and I would encourage you all to look at the report for a little bit more detail about what we were pulling out of these reports. But largely what we were doing was seeing how well they seem to have been informed by the guidance put together by this group of experts that put the strategy together. And it's clearly a very small sample of the work that's been going on, but it gives us a little bit of a sense about how climate change is showing up in planning documents and climate adaptation efforts. And I just wanted to pick out a few of the notable common themes that kind of ran across all of these reports. A lot of them don't refer to the strategy at all, but that's a little bit deceptive because they do refer to other guidance documents like climate smart conservation that may have involved some of the same people, and we're certainly aware of, if nothing else, of the guidance that was coming out in 2012. So there's a lot of shared thought, and we want that. One of the goals of the network that Maggie mentioned is to continue that practice of comparing notes and looking for best practices. But so, for example, climate change is a threat. Everybody recognizes that now, or most everybody does. There was a little bit of doubt about that maybe 20 years ago, but by the time the strategy came out, there wasn't a lot of doubt. And certainly that doubt has largely dissipated by now. So we know it's a threat. We have a better sense of how fast things are changing and what the impacts might be. Almost every report, whether or not you're focusing specifically on climate change or other aspects of wildlife management or fisheries management, number one focus is often on habitat, on ecosystem integrity, whatever that is, but on the intactness and the functionality of ecosystems, on the importance of paying attention to non-climate stressors so that climate change as a threat multiplier isn't making those things a lot worse, and also on the need for additional research, continuing monitoring, and figuring out what exactly the impacts have been and look like they're going to be as we assess vulnerability going forward. Some of the needs that were identified in most of these reports focused on the scale of efforts. It's not really going to be effective if we all focus on little bits of the landscape. We need to consider the broader landscape, regional responses, because things are shifting, ranges are shifting, climate is certainly shifting, where suitable habitat is, and that sort of thing. And that's going to require cross-jurisdictional collaboration and also cross-sectoral solutions. It's not just a wildlife problem, it's a food production problem, it's an infrastructure problem, it's a water resources problem. And we have to solve those problems as a package so that, you know, it's not just a matter of the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, it's that the left hand could be subverting the efforts of the right hand. So these things need to be solved holistically. We came up in this report with a bunch of management recommendations, and you've seen those already, I think, and certainly go look at the report. But when we talk about some of the things that we've seen in response to the 2012 strategy and where we need to go in the future, you know, we came up with these recommendations that are largely built on those earlier recommendations and respond to some of those needs that I just identified. And I don't have time to read through all these, but you'll get a sense of how these concerns that we've been talking about connect to the recommendations that we're making. And again, I've already mentioned some of these things. This last one, though, I wanted to really emphasize, and that is we need to be looking forward. We can't just be focusing on how the world has been in our neighborhoods, in our jurisdiction, in our piece of land that we're managing. We have to think about where it's going in the future, how the conditions there are changing, and what implications that might have for, you know, best practices going forward. I think one of the things that we identified is we need to do more of this kind of comparison crosswalk with what people are doing and best practices, and kind of sort out what we have learned in the last 10 years, what works, what doesn't work, and what the major uncertainties are. So we think that we need to spend a little bit more time going through the plans that people are actually doing, the things that they're implementing, and coming up with maybe a good sense of what we need to be doing in the future. So that's what I got. And let me pass it back to Maggie, who's going to wrap us up.
Thank you, Bob. Let me share my screen. All right, hopefully you can all see that. So I'm going to turn our attention now to part 3 of the report, which really focused on recommendations and next steps. I think what you'll see from part 1 and part 2 is that they're chock full of information, and they really served as an excellent way for the contributors to consider what the strategy has accomplished, maybe what it missed out on, and where it needs to go next. And so from this, we were able to pull out a variety of recommendations for what we see for the future. So you've seen this slide a few times now in various forms, but these are our 13 management recommendations. And I want to just focus on one of these, namely the one that calls out the need for the conservation community to assess and include the needs of marginalized communities through both equitable and meaningful consultation and engagement for climate adaptation planning and implementation. So in addition to these 13 management recommendations, we also put forth a recommendation for the inclusion of a goal 8. And this is probably our most significant recommendation out of the report. You may remember that both Bob and I shared those 7 strategy goals from the 2012 strategy. And so the idea would be to include an 8th goal in that, and that would specifically focus on including people in this process. You know, more and more we are realizing that talking about humans and nature as 2 separate entities is really out of step with ecological realities. And we also recognize that for far too long, the conservation community has not had adequate representation and engagement from diverse and marginalized communities. So the goal is Goal 8 is meant to address this oversight and to clearly call out the need for representation and inclusion and engagement. This isn't to say that the strategy was devoid of including people in the process. It did, but it didn't elevate the issue to the level of importance that it deserves. And so we believe by formally including this as a goal, we can address that gap a little bit better. In addition to all of these recommendations, the report also outlines 4 next steps. So the first of those is that until such time that JWIG or other federally led interagency group can be reestablished, the network will continue to advance and steward the strategy. The second is that we recommend the immediate inclusion of Goal 8 into the strategy. In addition, tactics and actions will need to be developed in the same format as they were for goals 1 through 7 to provide guidance on how to fully implement Goal 8 in practice. And I think this will provide the opportunity to explain the nuances in community engagement, equity, justice, inclusion, consultation, engagement, and other issues interrelated to people, conservation, and climate adaptation. Third, we'd like to see the development of best management practices to guide practitioners on both alignment and coordination of the strategy across sectors and agencies. This will ensure greater mainstreaming of climate adaptation with a focus specifically on natural resources. And finally, our 4th recommendation is to conduct an in-depth crosswalk and assessment of federal, state, tribal, and nonprofit plans to identify areas of both accomplishments and barriers to implementing the strategy. And so this would help in developing key strategies for agency personnel to better quantify and record efforts related to climate adaptation efforts. So that is a very, very brief summation of both part 3 and the whole strategy. And so I just want to say a quick thank you to all of the contributors and especially to all of the presenters today. There's so much information in there. And so I do just want to flag for you if you're interested in taking a look at the full report, you can access that by going to the website listed on the slide. We also have a variety of fact sheets that can give you short 1 to 2 page summations of some of the bigger sections, such as the management recommendations and the Indigenous knowledges section. So we really encourage you to check them out. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Rob now, who is going to help facilitate our Q&A session.
Thanks, Maggie. Before I start with Q&A, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the 1842 Ojibwe ceded territories in northern Wisconsin, lands that were ceded to the United States government throughout the 1800s in a series of treaties, and on which the tribes retained their rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the lands that were ceded to the US. So the first question that I have, and this is for the entire panel, After the strategy was released in 2012, it seemed like federal agencies, tribes, states, and other entities continued to approach climate adaptation for natural resources in a piecemeal fashion, as evidenced by the majority of sample plans discussed in the crosswalk section, most of which do not mention or cite the strategy or specific strategy goals. What makes even an updated National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy relevant in 2021 and beyond?
Thanks, Rob. I'll go ahead and take a stab at that. I think it's a great question. The strategy, I think, suffered from something that we see on a lot of conservation issues more broadly, and that's the fragmentation of communication and coordination among agencies and organizations. And, I always thought this was a shame because for those who have read or know the strategy well, they will tell you that it's a foundational document for practice. I've always been struck by how comprehensive it is and the fact that it's really rooted in action. So to me, doing the report was critical to addressing the changes that we're seeing and charting sort of that necessary evolution of the strategy, but also it was an opportunity to once again elevate the profile and introduce or maybe reintroduce these actions and issues that are of such critical importance to the way that we do conservation, or the way we should do conservation. And with the new administration's focus on climate change, we have this incredible opportunity to see that part of our response includes natural resources and includes adaptation, in addition to all of the mitigation and sequestration opportunities that are out there. And I think the report and the strategy can both serve as a sort of central focal point for more communication and coordination across the community.
Thanks, Maggie. Would anybody else from the panel like to weigh in before we move on to another question?
I'll jump in just briefly because I think Maggie said it very well. I think one of the things that jumps out at anybody that's ever been involved in trying to put a climate adaptation plan together is maybe how difficult it is to find out what anybody else is doing. So it's piecemeal, different agencies, different organizations focus on different things. There really hasn't been a holistic or comprehensive approach to this. And that has to change. And that's why the network came together, to try and bring as many people as possible into the conversation and just get them talking. And so our hope isn't so much, I mean, the white paper, the report that just came out is an important document that kind of lays all that out, but the rest of it has to do with this network, I think, and that is to have regular communications between practitioners, to compare notes on what they're doing, and to look for alignment and the possibility for synergies, and also just to make sure that you're not working at cross purposes across jurisdictional boundaries. I mean, I think we have to move in that direction. And as a non-agency person, I think that it would be great to see some sort of sustained effort in this regard that isn't all dependent on which administration is in power at the time. So I think people on the ground need to maybe figure out how to stay working together, stay in touch with each other, and to look for opportunities for collaboration.
Thanks, Bob. We'll move on to a related question from Greg, and that is, how will the success of the strategy be measured? If success is being measured, to what extent have those measures been collected? And that could be for anyone on the panel.
I'll jump in again, and I'm sure Bob can fill in any gaps that I have. But I think that was part of one of the challenges that we had with the strategy, was that those mechanisms really weren't identified going into it. And, you know, the JWIG, when it was still a group, they tried to track that through case studies. And so it was really anecdotal and it was nothing truly measurable. And so what we were getting at with part 2 that Bob covered is that, you know, it is very piecemeal. It's very, very hard to track. And I think that's something that anybody within this space can tell you, that a lot of people or a lot of agencies or groups are doing work on the ground that are responding to climate, and maybe they don't call it a climate project, and then it gets lost in the shuffle and never gets counted. And so that's why one of our recommendations for our next steps is to do a much more in-depth crosswalk and evaluation of various plans. And that is to help us try to get more at those measures of is the strategy being implemented and to what degree that it is. But I'll let Bob respond if he has more to add.
Not much more, actually. I think that you hit the main point. So hi, Greg, and great to see you here. And I think that's a great question. And Maggie has it exactly right. What we were trying to do is take a look at what people have been doing. And I think that there's some thought that we might be able to identify places as we move forward where we know there's going to be additional work. For example, the state wildlife action plans, the next round of them might be, coming up in a few years, not very far from now. And we might have something to say about how we would like to see climate change integrated into state wildlife action plans and other conservation efforts that are ongoing. But the original strategy actually called for monitoring of the impact of the strategy. And that was one of the things that inspired us to get this conversation started a couple of years ago. Let's see where that is. And if it doesn't look like it's, having the impact that the many people that were involved in putting that strategy together were hoping for, then maybe we should make some noise about that. And as you know, one of the places I'd like to make some noise about that is in the Wildlife Society. And there are others in American Fisheries Society too that I think would share that view. But I think that it's a good question. It's something that we need to, maybe start committing to answering.
Thanks, Bob. I think at this time, I want to move kind of our focus to the management recommendations and Goal 8 specifically. How would you recommend agencies go about engaging with marginalized communities to implement Goal 8 and the management recommendations when those same communities are already dealing with existing inequalities, pollution, resource colonization, and systemic racism, among other things? And that's for the entire panel.
This is Rachel. I can speak more to the tribal nations component of that question. So it's important, we say Indigenous peoples often, but it's very important to be aware that Indigenous peoples, are part of Indigenous nations, tribal nations. There's federally recognized tribes that have their own government set up. There's state recognized tribes that often also have their own government set up. And it's important to be aware of that and to engage with tribes as sovereign nations that have self-determining rights. And so I think that's important to recognize rather than kind of just another city or another community. And so I think that is like something very helpful in trying to develop like a relationship and approach these communities in a respectful way, be aware of protocols. If there's decisions, the state Fish and Wildlife Agency is considering, think about adding like a consultation to that, especially since so many of the lands you're probably talking about are ancestral lands of the Indigenous communities in your states. So that's what I would say, I think, to that in terms of more like the Indigenous nations component of that, the overall communities that we're talking about. So I'll stop there. See if anyone has anything else to add.
Yeah, I would just add on, this is an important question that every person in conservation should be considering. And, the issues, Rob, that you highlighted fall squarely in the environment, like clean air, clean water, land rights. All of these existing inequalities are part of a system and are part of a culture. And so no response to any of these issues would be complete unless we look at every facet. And that includes the role that conservation and the conservation community plays in that. Now, I mentioned that one of our next steps is to develop those tactics and actions that align with our recommendation for goal 8. So we don't have specific recommendations to share at this moment, but part of the reason we're having webinars like this today is to not only raise awareness for the report, but to reach out to the community and invite them to help us envision what a more inclusive culture for conservation would look like. So, how can the benefit, how can benefits to communities who are dealing with these multiple crises, how can we better understand what those benefits that conservation provides to them are? And the last thing that I'll just highlight is that I think from a state agency perspective, I think they're really starting to begin to recognize their role and responsibility in these issues. And they have a long way to go. But if you're looking for resources right now, I definitely encourage folks to check out the relevancy roadmap, which is available on AFWA's website. And it's a great resource for considering how agencies can start to make more meaningful change in their communities and demonstrate their relevance in this conversation.
Yeah, as always, Maggie has great answers to questions like this. The one thing that I think I would like to add to it is, I think agencies would, and I know everybody has, limited budgets. I think that's a problem all by itself, and maybe we'll be able to make some progress in the current administration on that count. But I think one of the things that agencies need to do, and some are, and maybe some haven't made as much inroads on this as they can, is to bring in more of the social sciences and have people who are dedicated to working with local communities and understanding the needs of local communities and looking for synergies with the goals, values of local communities. And that includes Indigenous communities and people that understand, the circumstances of Indigenous communities in your neighborhood, but all communities, to make sure that people are actually dedicated to, making contact and being a consistent presence in those communities, rather than having wildlife biologists or whoever decide this is the way that we're going to do things and then telling other people about that. You need to bring those communities in from the ground up.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. When we talk about consultation, people always say early and often with tribal communities, tribal nations. I would add to what Bob and Maggie said too, and I think this goes for many communities of color, including Indigenous communities. But what Bob had said, considering hiring like a liaison, that can take the time and develop the relationships that build the trust with those communities. That's really important, and that might be someone that has more of a social scientist background. But also, since a lot of these communities might be strapped for resources too, from our perspective, we don't expect to like put a meeting out there and like have people just come from all over to attend that might not have the resources necessarily to do that, though they might have the interest. So, if there's a way to help present resources, especially for like traveling to like meetings that people are invited to, then we've seen that often like really increases the probability that they will attend, because sometimes, there's people are operating on a shoestring budget, like even in tribal nations, much less like communities of color that don't necessarily have, community resources. So I think that can also be a really important way to bring people to the table and build trust. Thanks.
So unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our hour. And that means we have to wind up our question and answer period. I'm going to turn it back to Maggie real quick for last words and say, Chimigwitz, thank you very much to everyone for joining us and for your questions.
Thank you for moderating, Rob. A thank you again to all of our panelists here. And thank you for everyone for joining today. I will send out the recording as soon as it is ready, but appreciate all of your interest, and please reach out if you have any questions that we didn't get to today. I'd be happy to answer those. Thanks so much.